Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another All Things M365 Compliance podcast with me, Ryan John Murphy, Microsoft Compliance SME. And of course, as always, I'm joined by Nikki. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Ryan. Hi, everybody. My name is Nikki Chappell. I'm a Principal Cloud Architect at Cloudway, and I'm also a Microsoft MVP. And both Ryan and myself are both passionate about everything, I suppose, Microsoft 365 compliance and really making sure your data is secure and governed. So,
Absolutely.
Ryan, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, today we've got a really interesting topic, and this always comes up no matter what customer, no matter what industry, no matter what size of your organization. This question always comes up as, Ryan, Nikki, where is my data stored for each of the applications inside of M365? And you, Nikki, yourself have written an amazing article on this, which has had massive amount of shares and views on LinkedIn and social media and so on and so forth. So we thought it'd be a great topic to talk about today. Why don't you tell us all about it?
Yeah, so this blog really came about that I'm working with a customer on eDiscovery. And, Microsoft keep putting out all of these new applications. So for me, it was really about starting up about my own discovery, making sure I understood about Loop and Copilot. Where is that data stored? And is it serviceable by eDiscovery? So as I started putting it down, I thought, well, let's go through and map all of the different applications. And we've got a huge amount of applications in Microsoft 365. So, people are familiar with things like your Word, your PowerPoint and Excel, but what about forms? Are you using Planner? What about the Loop component? And I thought, well, let's try and kind of put something down together and really understand, what data is shared where.
All right, cool. So I think this is always a very important question. And as I've mentioned many times before, I predominantly deal with heavily regulated industries, and they will always need to know the answer to the questions that you've actually got written down in this blog. So if anybody's watching this and that you're working somewhere and you're just kicking off a project, or these new applications that have come in that you've not yet adopted, Loop potentially being one of them, give this a read. We will share the link in the bio later on, but I think Nikki's going to share her screen in a minute just to go through it in brief. So if you're ever in a position where you need to know from a data residency perspective or data sovereignty perspective, or if even just general internal compliance needs, you can take a look through this blog. But as we go through this, we're going to explain a couple of other additions to maybe an introduction to Multi-Geo, if anybody's not familiar with that, or just a recap on that so you can map them both together. And then, of course, a subject close to my heart, we'll touch on eDiscovery a little bit, as Nikki had mentioned before, just so we can start to understand where eDiscovery comes into that and where that data is associated with a particular user or AKA a custodian, and where you can find specifically Teams data. Not a lot of people are aware that Teams data in the background is actually hosted on different types of infrastructure, depending on type of the communication that you're having. You would not believe the amount of eDiscovery cases I've gone to and helped people out where they've only had the site and not the group mailbox, or maybe they've had a user in there and not the files because they're only targeting a OneDrive of the recipient, not the sender, and so on and so forth. So let's get going. Let's have a look at your amazing piece of work, Nikki,
Okay.
and I'll let you run with it being the author.
Okay, well, I'll go through. So, yes, these are just really a view. I wanted to say, where is the data stored and what are the standard locations? So really the standard locations we're thinking about are kind of mailboxes and, OneDrive and SharePoint. So a lot of our data is stored there, but not all of it. So kind of thinking really about that. So if we start off, obviously everyone's familiar with things like their mail, their calendar, their contacts, and their to-do. They're all of the traditional items we find in our mailbox. But also we're getting information about Viva Insights. Now, the key thing about Viva Insights is that's personal to you. It's already surfacing additional data. It doesn't create any more data points. So, there is nothing to search, say, from an eDiscovery viewpoint for Viva Insights.
Got it.
Now, this is where it gets really important if you're working with things like eDiscovery and other compliance things, is that your OneDrive is storing information about Teams. So this is all about your compliance copies of your one-to-one and group chats, if you're having conversations in private channel messages, if you're having conversations in the meeting chats, and it gives a summary of things like your meeting and your calling history there as well. We've also got a similar thing for Viva Engage. So Viva Engage, formerly known as Yammer, is kind of a similar grouped back container. And again, if you're having private conversations in Viva Engage, that would also be stored in your mailbox. And Copilot, so that's beginning to make its way into people's tenants now. So I've had my first, I think, full week of using Copilot, and
Cool.
that information is actually being stored. So every time you create a prompt in Copilot, and the response plus any references to your files, that's actually been stored in your mailbox as well. And along with information about a copy of the forms and the response. So Ryan, why is it important that we've got these compliance copies in the mailbox?
For discoverability. All right. So the main aspect of any investigation is to bring back as much data as you possibly can relating to that particular subject or relating to those particular subjects or those custodians themselves. Now, as you've just mentioned with Copilot, those prompts are retrievable with eDiscovery, so you can see the interaction between the user and the Copilot, whichever one that may be. That then gives you the incentive to ensure that those interactions are within remit of maybe your business etiquette, or even within the remit of a compliance regulatory term, or whether it be SCA, Sec 17A, whichever. So it's very, very important for us to be for Microsoft to build these solutions where you have data collaborated with a user or shared from a user perspective, that we can use eDiscovery to go in and get that data to have it aligned with that litigation process. Hopefully that gives you a breakdown. Okay.
So as well as kind of the user mailbox, we've also got Sway in there. I'd forgotten about that. You've also got a group mailbox as well. So people are often unfamiliar with group mailbox. So every type of Microsoft 365 group, whether that's the Outlook-based group, and they were the more traditional ones where we're using email for the communication channels, but also Teams and Viva Engage communities have mailboxes. Even though their primary form of communication is more of an instant message type communication, there is still a mailbox behind the scenes. And the purpose of the mailbox is to store any of the communications if you're having any channel meetings in there. But importantly, it's to hold the compliance copies of the communications within your team. So these are your standard channel messages, and these are your shared channel messages. So all the compliance copies are kind of stored in there. And then that's the same for Viva Engage. If you're in a community, all of those community conversations are stayed there. So that's the importance of making sure you understand and include things like the mailbox within the search.
Yeah. What I will say as well, on the group mailbox, for anybody listening, one of the main aspects of the podcast today is to ensure that you're aware where data is situated. Just as a side topic, when people are running eDiscovery cases, they'll see now, if they're using eDiscovery Premium, that when you search for a specific Teams channel, it brings back the site and the group mailbox together, so you can choose them both. It's very important that you do choose them both, because like Nikki just mentioned, some of the data that you could be looking for or could be part of that investigation may just be in the group mailbox. So that's any of the chats and so on and so forth, or you could just be a particular file. Having them both linked into that eDiscovery case is essential for you to be able to bring that data back. So remember that when you're using eDiscovery standard or content search, make sure you've got those two collaborating data sets together.
So moving on, we've also got a separate type of mailbox. This is if you use Microsoft Bookings. So this is another type of mailbox. Probably less relevant to searches in there, because it's really just using the calendar capability. But another really, what am I going in here? I'm doing something wrong now. Let me stop sharing my screen. Something's gone wrong. I've got the wrong screen up. Here we go. Let me share again.
Sure.
So after mailboxes, now let's look at where kind of the files are stored. So there's two main file repositories really in Microsoft 365. You've got your user's OneDrive. So that's really the user's personal storage. So by default, it's private. Only the user can have access to that unless they share it out. And the other repository is SharePoint, and that's your collaborative space. So that's what stores your files in Teams and Viva Engage and Team SharePoint sites, communication SharePoint sites, etc. So let's look at the user's OneDrive. So this is their personal storage area. So I'll have things like the Word, the PowerPoint, your Excel files that you're creating. You could choose to store them there. You could also choose to store them on your SharePoint or your local drive, etc. If you create your own personal OneNote, that's stored in there. Stream, now this is really important. Stream is your video repository. So when you're creating a Teams meeting recording, if you're the person that records that video and it's not a channel meeting, then the meeting recording is stored under your OneDrive. So it's not who created the meeting. So for example, if Ryan created the meeting and invited me and we're in the same company, if I'm the one that selected record and transcription, that information is stored in my OneDrive. So that's really important when you're doing these discoveries, who was in the meeting, because it's not just the inviter, it could be somebody else in the organization that stored that information.
Yeah, indeed.
You can actually store lists. I didn't realize if you use the lists app, you could create a list in your OneDrive. Normally the lists are in SharePoint, but there could be something in there where you're storing information. Loop components, and this is one of the new features. You've got this option now, whether you're in like a Teams chat or whether you're in an email, etc. You can start pulling in these components. So it might be, here's a list of tasks, agenda items, tables, etc. These are all components, and they're now being stored in your OneDrive unless you're creating them from a team channel. So if they're stored anywhere else, they're in your personal OneDrive. But of course, again, these are items that are collaborative. You're sharing them out with colleagues around the organization and say, you know, we need to organize something, we need to start planning. So a lot of people are beginning to move this for kind of project planning activities. I think being unaware that they're actually stored in an end user's OneDrive. We've got whiteboards. Whiteboards are only stored in the user's OneDrive. So you, again, in a Teams meeting, you can pull up a whiteboard and you can start collaborating. Whoever created or added that whiteboard, they're the kind of custodian of that item. So you could have had, Ryan could have created the meeting, so he's the inviter. I could have pressed record and started recording, and a third person could have brought up the whiteboard. So you've suddenly got 3 individual people that you now need to make sure that you kind of do that full search on. We've got Clipchamp, so this is new coming in. So this is like video editing stuff. So there's probably not much from a compliance viewpoint here, because the output is going to be your MP4, which is stored in Stream. So it's more of an editing, and I think probably an image repository. So that's kind of starting to bring its way in, really. So that's kind of the OneDrive. So any kind of points or notes really on that?
I think just one thing just one important thing I should say, based on pretty much from a Stream perspective, is if you're looking for modern attachments in eDiscovery, then it's always going to be the person who shared the file, not the person who received the file. So if you're ever looking for a particular file or groupings of files, always ensure that you're looking at the sender, not the recipient. Some people will just assume because I shared it with you, Nikki, you actually have it in your OneDrive. You don't. You just essentially just have a modern attachment linked to my OneDrive. So that's an important point. I feel is relevant in this case as well.
Yeah, and I think something also about modern attachments, which is really useful now in eDiscovery, a recent change, is that when you send that modern attachment link to me, actually what's happening behind this for eDiscovery purposes, you can actually say which version of that file was shared, because that file could have been created 1 year ago and it could have been updated subsequent to the share. So you can actually say, well, it was this version of the file that was shared with Nikki, rather than, oh, it was this file and you've got 500 versions to kind of look through.
Which is very important for your heavily regulated environments. Financial services comes to mind with Sec 17A. It's Sec 17A, should I say? It's the file at the point of share, which is part of what you would be looking for from the litigation perspective. And then you have the post versions before that, if there's 10 before that, if I share number 11 with you, Nikki, and then, sorry, the pre ones, I beg your pardon, and then the post ones as well, up to 50 or whatever the case may be. Just a quick tip for anybody as well, and I've learned this over a lot of lessons learned with eDiscovery. If you're looking for a specific modern attachment, use Content Explorer, because it literally just brings back the file in question without having to bring back most of the elements of what are inside of the particular site where the file is located. So just a quick tip there.
So if we move on to SharePoint, so this is, as I mentioned before, this is more your collaborative area. So this isn't owned by an individual, and SharePoint is used for storing your files in Teams, storing your files and things like that, Viva Engage, as well as kind of your non-group, traditional, I suppose, communication sites. So again, we're all familiar with storing our Word, PowerPoint, Excel type files up on SharePoint, and we're encouraged to do so, really. Top tip really is you've got to think about a OneDrive is related to a user. When that user leaves the organization, there's a default retention period of 30 days. The company may change that. If you haven't got any other retention policies, all of that content that we showed you in the user's OneDrive will get deleted. Indeed. So if you've been sharing, important corporate assets, you've got a risk of data loss. So best practice, corporate assets store in a SharePoint site somewhere. If you've got a team OneNote, so you've got that notes tab that's stored in your SharePoint. You've got your videos. So these tend to be from any channel recordings or anything that, if you create a video from your team or your group. Lists, so lists are more commonly found in SharePoint, so you can go into Teams at the top and say, add in a list, or it could be in the SharePoint site. So they're used a lot. It's almost like Excel on steroids in some cases, isn't it?
Yeah.
But for some functionality, it's a good way of storing information and being able to filter it and run workflows, etc. So a lot of people are using kind of lists for that. I suppose low code workflow. We've got loop components. So this is if you're creating loop components within a Teams channel, they are stored in the SharePoint site. And planner attachments. So if you've got planner and you've got a planner task and you've got that option to attach, you can either link to a file or you can kind of upload a file. Those files are stored there as well. So any tips or comments really on SharePoint?
Nothing springs to mind with SharePoint, to be perfectly honest with you, but maybe one thing which I do see quite often is, as you've mentioned there, Nikki, SharePoint is for your corporate files. You shouldn't be having personal files on here for particular individuals and so on and so forth. And having that well-designed SharePoint structure to ensure that only corporate files are added into SharePoint is definitely a good way to be.
So the other thing we were talking about actually before this is that particularly for SharePoint, as well as I suppose you can do it for OneDrive and mailboxes, we can have multi-geo capabilities as well. So for large multinational organizations where you need to ensure you've got that data residency, then you can actually say, I want my mailbox, my OneDrive, or my SharePoint site to live in a particular geographic region. So again, that's important, I think, for the OneDrive's information and as to where is that data being stored. Is there a risk of data being stored outside of your kind of locality?
Yeah, and there's a good point actually. And I think again, not to labor the point, most of the customers I deal with will use Multi-Geo purely because it does give them that data residency / to a degree data sovereignty when it comes to the user's data and where it's located, but it is a preferred data location. It's not a static data location. And that preferred data location tag could just be added to particular sites or mailboxes. It just essentially means that all that data would then be in that preferred region. It is not a performance tool. Some people look at it and say we can use it as a performance tool because we've got different people in different continents, whatever the case may be. Yes, it does increase that your performance from the end user, but it's an additional license on top of everything else that you have, so it can get very expensive. So I would only use it when you really need to use it from a data residency or data sovereignty element.
So we've now also in SharePoint, we've got something called SharePoint Embedded. So this is kind of new. Microsoft announced SharePoint Embedded at ESPC 23 back in the end of November of last year. So yeah. What information is being stored in SharePoint Embedded? So some of our Loop workspaces, so this is a new kind of feature with our Loop, is that we can create a workspace. So it's like a group where you can invite members to it and you can add lots of components to it, but it's not being backed by your Microsoft 365 groups. It's got its own way of managing membership. I'm really personally interested about how all the compliance features will work with SharePoint Embedded. It's still quite new on that, but that's just something to point out. If you start creating these workspaces, they're not like a team or a Viva engaged community that's backed by a Microsoft 365 group. It's being stored in SharePoint Embedded. The designer product that is being launched, to do your images, that's in there. And really, SharePoint Embedded is to allow you to create your custom applications and have an API that allows you to store data in SharePoint Embedded. So basically, once SharePoint Embedded is enabled, basically it's taking almost like a separate partition. You've got your SharePoint you're using with your groups, your teams, your sites, the things that we described before, your OneDrive, and then there's a second SharePoint set up, and it's really for these custom applications. So at the moment, the compliance features in this are probably very low because it's very new. It's like everything Microsoft push out, the newer it is, the less compliance features, and then over time it gets more mature and you get better functionality. So just be aware if you're starting to think about using custom applications and you're storing data in there, that you're going to need to search how we're going to get that out. Make sure that it's retrievable.
Yeah. Indeed. One thing I'd noticed about Designer as well, and I think it was post-Christmas, and everybody was creating avatars for themselves based on Jack's post on LinkedIn. I noticed very quickly that Designer pushes all of those designs into your OneDrive. And I got a message from OneDrive saying that I'd reached my limit. I was like, oh, man, I had like 5 gig left. What's going on? And then I looked in my OneDrive and I saw all of these designer images, and there was actually like just hundreds of them that it creates, because sometimes it can create like 5 or 6 at a time. So yeah, if you're using that with your corporate account, just ensure you clear your OneDrive out, because it will fill up quite quickly and you might get some complaints from those who pay the bills.
So then we've got information that's actually stored outside of your kind of tenant boundaries. So Teams is actually one of those. So actually uses Azure services for its messaging services. That's because of the way that it's it needs to be fast, it needs to be dynamic. So it's an Azure-based service, but it's always stored within your tenant boundaries. So if you've got your tenant and it's mastered in the EU, for example, it would be in the EU or the UK, US, etc. Viva Engage. So again, that's using Azure-based services. At the moment, it's in 2 main locations. So they have guaranteed that if you're in the EU, your data is being stored in the EU. Other than that, it's likely to be in the US. There may be some few other places. Microsoft Forms, again, that one is another service outside of your tenant. mainly EU, US, and Australia. So they've guaranteed if you're in Australia for data residency, it'll be stored there. If you're in the EU, it's in the EU. Otherwise, it's like to be the US. And then you've got Planner as well. It's got a little bit more areas with Planner. But again, you know, if we're in the EU, our data is being stored in the EU area here as well.
Good to see. Good to see.
But as we've shown, that a lot of the time, to make sure that things like e-compliance and searchability work, that's the reason why we're taking compliance copies, because the master of these services are in other managed Microsoft locations, and they're just pushing those copies into the relevant mailboxes so we can do the searches quickly and easily.
Excellent.
So I thought really wrap this up. One of the key reasons why I was doing this is what do we need to know for compliance purposes? You know, where do we need to search for teams? So when we're talking about what do we need to include when we are adding in the user's mailbox? So we add in the user's mailbox. We've got their Teams chat, their private channel, messages, which is really important to add all the people from the private channel in that. Your anything voicemails, call details, records, things like that are being stored in the user's OneDrive. And then we've got, user's mailbox, and then we've got the group mailbox. So that's your standard and your shared channels only. It is important to understand, if you're adding a team in, what type of channels has the team got? And do we need to include the users in as well?
We're not seeing the group mailbox up on screen there, Nikki.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, there we go. Oh, no, that's
OneDrive. So group mailbox is just down the bottom here, so it's split.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Yeah, sorry, my mistake. I missed that. Yeah.
So OneDrive. So normally when you put a custodian on search, you put their user mailbox and their OneDrive would go on hold. But the types of information in there is Teams meeting recordings. So just to reiterate, that's the person who presses record. If you shared a whiteboard, also things like, as Ryan mentioned earlier, the person who shares the file in a chat or in a Teams meeting.
And I will say as well, not to hijack this as an eDiscovery call, but as we're going through the call details records, this always comes up of, you know, who attended the meeting and for how long, and how long did the meeting go on. You can actually find that within eDiscovery. You can have a user KQL query to do that, or you can use the metadata to do that. It's definitely worthwhile trying to figuring that out, because that does give you a good remit of those participants. And as Nikki just alluded to there, especially with the OneDrive, when it comes to who kicked off the meeting, who kicked off the recording, who shared the whiteboard, a lot of people will just look for the person who created the meeting. And if that's me, Nikki, it's not going to have all that information in there. A good tip when it comes to eDiscovery, use the participants field in the KQL builder or the actual card builder, as it's known. Don't add in to and from. Use the participants. It brings everybody back, and at that point, you'll actually get more data that's relevant to that particular meeting, and you'll also see then who's doing what, where, and when.
And then the other thing with eDiscovery, you can always go back and add other people in. So even though that user may not be a custodian, they're a person of interest. So you can bring that in as a non-custodian data source to say, actually, I now need to go and do a more detailed search potentially of their OneDrive or their mailbox.
You can indeed.
And then we've got SharePoint as well. So from a Teams viewpoint, when you go into your Files tab, that's where your channel files are all being stored. If you're using channel meetings and you record, then that's being stored in the channel rather than the OneDrive. The Notes tab, that's got your OneNote. So you've got all of the different sections that will be all in there. If you're using Planner within your team, then you've got potentially file attachments there. If you're doing a whiteboard in a channel meeting, and also if you allow people to email the channel. So a lot of organizations have got this blocked, but if you've got it open, what you can do is you can forward an email to a Teams channel. So you can do that quite easily from your Outlook if it's enabled. You pick your team, you pick your channel, and the email goes in. So there'll be a folder per month, and it will have the email that you forward in. It will also contain any attachments that email had in as well. So you're bringing it in there. So they're the kind of different locations really that you need to consider when you're working with Teams.
Amazing. I think there's probably people out there watching or listening to this now who find this huge benefit, because as we said in the beginning, a lot of this is asked a lot from customers. And usually in your first engagement, even when they've been using 365 for quite some time and they want to adopt a new application, like I said, understanding where that data is and how to retrieve that data for compliance needs is essential for anybody, regardless of your size of organization, as I said in the beginning. So I think this has been a really good one, really in depth and really informative. Good work on that, Nikki. I think you've got a fantastic blog there.
Thank you very much. So I think probably what we'll do for another recording is actually go through an eDiscovery case looking for just the teams. Just go through how would you make sure that you include the relevant people. If you've got private channels or shared channels, where do you start with that? So kind of go through that from basics, just so you know that if you're using private channels and shared channels within your organization, how you make sure you've got the scope correct.
Yeah, indeed, that'd be really good. That'd be a very interesting podcast to do, as I'm sure everyone's aware. Big love for eDiscovery, so let's get a few eDiscovery ones going. I'm sure they'll make for good podcasts and podcasts.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Please subscribe to our channel, All Things M365 Compliance. So yeah, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me. Thanks very much for your time. See you next time. Bye for now.